classroom buzzes with nervous energy as students shuffle in their seats, exchanging glances and whispers about the upcoming return of their graded papers. The walls are adorned with posters of inspirational quotes, but the atmosphere in the room feels far from uplifting. The fluorescent lights overhead flicker intermittently, casting a harsh glow over the desks below. Mr. Anderson, a middle-aged teacher with a stern expression and a reputation for being tough on his students, stands at the front of the classroom. His chalk-stained fingers flip through a stack of papers, and with each paper he hands back, a small collective sigh seems to ripple through the room. He's known for being merciless when it comes to grading. No one dares to approach him with questions about their scores. They simply accept their fate. Jamal, a 17-year-old black student with dreams of attending college, sits at the back of the room, nervously tapping his pen against the desk. He has worked tirelessly on his recent essay, a paper he poured his heart into. Despite coming from a disadvantaged background, Jamal has always prided himself on his work ethic and determination. He's well aware that education is his ticket out of the cycle of poverty, and he's committed to making something of himself. But today, he feels an unexpected weight settling on his shoulders as Mr. Anderson approaches his desk. With a flick of his wrist, Mr. Anderson slides Jamal's paper across the table. Jamal's heart sinks as he sees the bold red F glaring back at him. Confusion fills his mind. He knows he did everything right, spent countless hours on research, and revised his work multiple times. How could this be? Without missing a beat, Mr. Anderson's voice rings out over the classroom, cutting through the murmurs. Jamal, I really thought you were smarter than this, but I guess I was wrong, he says, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room falls silent and all eyes shift to Jamal. You don't seem to care about your education, Mr. Anderson continues. You're lazy, and that's why you'll never amount to anything. You can't even manage to put together a decent paper. Jamal's stomach turns, but he remains silent. He feels the heat rising in his face, the sting of humiliation burning his cheeks. His classmates look away, unsure whether to watch or avoid the confrontation. Some smirk behind their hands, while others squirm uncomfortably in their seats. Jamal feels like a target, an object of ridicule, and his self-doubt starts to creep in. Despite the onslaught of harsh words, Jamal doesn't raise his voice. He's used to being treated unfairly, but that doesn't make it any easier. His hands tremble as he holds the paper, the weight of Mr. Anderson's words pressing down on him. Sir, I put everything I had into this paper, Jamal says quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Anderson looks at him with a sneer. Save it, Jamal. If you were truly invested in your education, you'd be putting in real effort. This, he gestures dismissively to the paper. This is the result of someone who thinks they can skate by without trying. Jamal lowers his gaze to the paper, the ink bleeding into his vision. A red F stares back at him, the weight of the world behind it. Jamal sits in his chair, feeling the weight of the red F burning a hole into his chest. His fingers clutch the paper tightly, his knuckles turning white. He knows this grade isn't fair, knows that something deeper is at play. But what can he do about it? His heart races as he struggles to keep his composure. Finally, gathering the courage to speak, Jamal looks up at Mr. Anderson. Sir, I really don't understand. I spent hours working on this paper. I followed all your instructions. You said we should show critical thinking, provide sources, and back up our arguments. I did all that, but still, you gave me an F. Mr. Anderson raises an eyebrow, his expression tight and unyielding. Jamal, you're wasting your time. If you spent as much time on your work as you did talking, maybe you'd actually accomplish something. He pauses, clearly savoring his power over the situation. Honestly, it's people like you who think they can just show up and get a pass, when in reality, you're not putting in the effort. Jamal's face flushes with a mix of frustration and disbelief. He knows he did his best, and yet this teacher, who is supposed to guide him, seems determined to hold him down. He leans forward, his voice a little stronger now, though still steady. With all due respect, Mr. Anderson, this feels unfair. I worked hard, and I've always tried my best in your class. Why am I being singled out? The class falls silent, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Some of the students glance nervously at each other, unsure of how to react. Jamal can feel the eyes of his classmates on him, some of them looking uncomfortable, others seeming resigned. But none of them speak up. Mr. Anderson narrows his eyes, clearly irritated. Oh, I see what this is. You think this is about your race? That somehow I'm being harder on you because you're black. His voice grows colder, dripping with sarcasm. Well, maybe you're just not cut out for this level of work. Maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe it's you. Jamal's stomach twists. The words sting more than he's prepared for. He has heard the whispers before, the assumptions others have made about him, but never so openly from a teacher, a supposed authority figure, someone who should be fostering his growth, not tearing it down. The classroom falls deathly silent, and Jamal feels as if the walls are closing in on him. He wants to fight back, to tell Mr. Anderson that his comment is wrong, that it's not about his ability, but about the prejudices people like him hold. But Jamal's mind races, and words fail him. Instead, he sits there, gripped by a mixture of hurt and confusion. He had never imagined this kind of treatment from a teacher. Lila, Jamal's best friend, who has been sitting quietly beside him, suddenly speaks up. Her voice is hesitant at first, but it carries a note of firmness. Mr. Anderson, that's not fair. Jamal's worked hard, and you're not being reasonable. You can't just make it about race. This is about his effort and his work. Jamal is grateful for Lila's words, but at the same time, the situation feels worse. All eyes now shift toward her, and some students exchange uncomfortable glances. Lila's voice cracks slightly as she adds, "If you're going to grade him like this, you should grade us all the same. Otherwise, it's just not right." Mr. Anderson scoffs, clearly dismissing her. "Lila, you should stay out of this. You don't understand what's going on here." He turns back to Jamal, his gaze hardening. "And you, Jamal, don't try to make this into something it's not. You're just looking for a way out of this." Jamal feels the weight of his teacher's words, and he can sense the tension mounting. The room is growing suffocating, and he's aware of the onlookers, the uncomfortable silence from his peers who seem unwilling to speak up. But Lila isn't done. She leans forward and adds, "If you're going to say things like that, we need to talk to the principal. This isn't just about a grade anymore. It's about fairness." Jamal's heart pounds as the idea settles in. Report this teacher? Would anyone believe them? What would it do to his already fragile standing in the class? His mind swirls with fear. He had seen others before him speak up, only to be ignored or ridiculed. The idea of fighting back is daunting. What if no one believed him? What if it just made things worse? Jamal looks around the room at his classmates, hoping for support. But all he sees are blank faces, some unsure, some resigned. It feels like an uphill battle he isn't ready to fight. He looks back at Mr. Anderson, trying to muster some courage. But before he can speak, Mr. Anderson interrupts again, his voice dripping with disdain. "Maybe you should think about where you really belong, Jamal. You obviously don't understand what it takes to be successful in this world. But maybe, just maybe, you'll learn." The words sting like a slap in the face, and Jamal fights back the tears. He wants to scream, to call out the injustice, but instead, he just sits there, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. Jamal sat in his room, the paper before him like a challenge that needed to be conquered. His mind replayed the scene from class earlier, the sting of Mr. Anderson's words still fresh in his mind. He knew his answers were solid. He had done the research, put in the effort, and followed the guidelines. But despite his hard work, he had been given an F for reasons that didn't make sense. He pulled the paper closer, his pencil scratching on the margins as he cross-referenced his responses with the textbook and online resources. One by one, he checked his answers. His heart sank when he realized that, indeed, he had followed the instructions to the letter. His argument in the essay was logical, supported by facts, and clearly laid out. There was no reason for his grade to be this low, no reason at all. It wasn't just the grade. It was the unjust way he had been treated, dismissed, humiliated, and stereotyped by a teacher who should have been encouraging his growth. Jamal clenched his fists, feeling the rush of frustration surge through him. But then a spark of something else flickered in his chest. Determination. He wouldn't let this go. "I know I'm right," he muttered to himself, "and I'm not going to just sit back and let him get away with this." Jamal got up from his desk and walked over to the stack of books on his shelf, pulling out the school's handbook and flipping through the pages until he found the section on academic integrity. There it was, a clear policy that stated all students had the right to challenge their grades if they felt they had been graded unfairly. He had the right to request a grade review. The next step was gathering support. Jamal thought about Lila. She had stood by him when no one else would, when the whole class seemed to turn a blind eye to Mr. Anderson's behavior. She believed in him, and that belief meant everything. Jamal grabbed his phone and sent her a quick message. "Lila, I'm going to talk to the principal about Mr. Anderson. Do you think you could help me gather some evidence? I need to show that my grade wasn't fair." Within minutes, Lila responded, "Of course, Jamal. I've got your back. We'll get this sorted." Jamal smiled to himself, feeling a little lighter. With Lila's help, he could do this. He wasn't alone. Later that afternoon, Leela and Jamal sat down together, reviewing his work and compiling a list of evidence. Lila had noticed some of the inconsistencies in the grading as well, and together they found that Jamal had answered more questions correctly than Mr. Anderson had given him credit for. Lila even pointed out areas where Mr. Anderson had missed key points in Jamal's essay that should have been acknowledged. But they still needed one more thing: a teacher's support. "Let's talk to Ms. Carter," Lila suggested. "She's always been kind and fair to you, right? Maybe she can back up your claims." Jamal agreed, and they made their way to Ms. Carter's classroom after school. When they walked in, Ms. Carter was sitting at her desk grading papers. She looked up and smiled, welcoming them. "Hey, Ms. Carter," Jamal said nervously. "I really need your help with something. It's about my grade in Mr. Anderson's class." Ms. Carter raised an eyebrow, concern flooding her expression. "What happened, Jamal?" Jamal explained the situation, detailing his interactions with Mr. Anderson and showing her his graded paper. Ms. Carter read through the essay, nodding thoughtfully as she went along. When she finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at him. "You're absolutely right, Jamal," she said softly. This grade is not a reflection of your work. Your answers are solid, and your arguments are sound. I'm happy to support you in this." Jamal's heart lifted. Having Ms. Carter's backing was invaluable. She was respected among the faculty, and her word carried weight. "We'll go to the principal's office together," she continued. "I'll make sure your voice is heard." Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time, he felt like his efforts mattered, not just in class, but in the broader fight against the unfair treatment he had faced. The next day, Jamal, Lila, and Miss Carter walked into Principal Green's office. The principal, a tall, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, greeted them warmly but with an air of seriousness. When Jamal explained the situation, Miss Carter backed him up, pointing out the inconsistencies in the grading and the way Jamal had been treated. Principal Green listened attentively, her face a mask of professionalism. After a few moments, she turned to Jamal and said, "I'm glad you brought this to my attention. We will review the grading and ensure that fairness is maintained in this school. Thank you for your patience, Jamal." Jamal nodded, his heart pounding. He knew this was just the first step, but it was a big one. The moment felt like a turning point, not just for him, but for all students who might have faced similar injustices. "You're doing the right thing, Jamal," Miss Carter said as they walked out of the office. "Standing up for yourself and for what's right takes courage. I'm proud of you." Jamal's chest swelled with pride. He wasn't just fighting for a grade anymore. He was fighting for the respect and recognition he deserved. And with the support of his friends, teachers, and his own resolve, he knew he could win this fight. Jamal sat nervously across from Principal Harris, his heart racing as he watched her review the details of his complaint. The principal, a calm and level-headed woman, carefully flipped through the papers Jamal had provided, including his graded assignment and the evidence Lila had helped him gather. The air in the office was thick with anticipation. "Okay, Jamal," Principal Harris said, setting down the papers. "I'll be honest, when I first heard about this, I wasn't sure how serious the issue was, but I can see you've put a lot of effort into this, and I think it warrants a closer look." Jamal nodded, trying to steady his nerves. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The chance to show that he wasn't just some angry student complaining about a grade. He was a student who had been treated unfairly and was willing to stand up for what was right. "I appreciate you taking the time, Miss Harris," Jamal said quietly. "I just want to prove that I did the work. The grade doesn't reflect what I put into it, and I think Mr. Anderson treated me unfairly because of who I am." Principal Harris leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she read through the papers once more. After a few moments, she raised an eyebrow. "I see what you're saying, Jamal. You've done your work, and the grading appears inconsistent. But I also want to make sure we're looking at this from all angles. I'm going to investigate." The principal picked up her phone and called in Miss Carter, the teacher who had been supporting Jamal. The two teachers spoke briefly before Principal Harris hung up. "I've asked Miss Carter to gather feedback from your classmates," Principal Harris explained. "I want to hear from the students who were in class with you and Mr. Anderson. We'll get a better picture of how he's been grading overall." Jamal felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't just his word against Mr. Anderson's now. There would be multiple voices involved in uncovering the truth. "I'll also need to review Mr. Anderson's grading records," Principal Harris continued, "to see if this is an isolated incident, or if there's a larger pattern here." Her voice hardened slightly. "If there is any evidence of bias, it will not be tolerated." Jamal was taken aback by her firm stance. For the first time, he felt like someone in a position of authority was truly listening to him and taking his concerns seriously. As the days passed, Principal Harris carried out her investigation. She met with Jamal's classmates, including Lila, and asked for their feedback. The students confirmed Jamal's experience, with several mentioning that Mr. Anderson had been unfairly harsh toward certain students, particularly those from minority backgrounds. Principal Harris also uncovered a troubling pattern in Mr. Anderson's grading. Not only did he give disproportionately low grades to students of color, but his comments on their assignments were often dismissive or critical, without valid reasoning. The evidence was clear. Mr. Anderson had been allowing his personal biases to influence his grading. When Principal Harris met with Mr. Anderson to confront him about his behavior, he was defensive at first, but when presented with the facts, he had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. "I've been reviewing your grading records," Principal Harris said, her voice calm but firm. "There's clear evidence that you've been grading students unfairly, particularly those from minority backgrounds. I'm afraid I can't let this slide." Mr. Anderson sputtered, trying to justify his actions, but Principal Harris had already made her decision. "You will be placed on administrative leave while we conduct a full review of your actions. Depending on the results, there may be further consequences." Jamal sat in the office, waiting for the final outcome. He felt a mixture of pride and relief. For once, his voice had been heard, and his hard work had been recognized. He had stood up for himself and for others, and it was making a difference. As the principal spoke to him again after her meeting with Mr. Anderson, Jamal knew that he had done the right thing. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Jamal," Principal Harris said, offering him a warm smile. "This was a difficult situation, but you handled it with courage and integrity. You've shown us all the importance of standing up for what's right." The school assembly was held in the gymnasium, and the entire student body gathered to hear the important announcement. Jamal sat in the front row, his heart pounding as he waited for the principal to speak. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, with whispers circulating among students who had heard about the incident. Principal Harris stood at the podium, her expression serious yet compassionate, as she addressed the students. "Today, we are here to address a matter of fairness and integrity," she began, her voice clear and strong. "Our school's commitment to justice is something we hold dear, and when those values are violated, it is our duty to correct them." She paused, looking around the room before continuing. "It has come to my attention that one of our teachers, Mr. Anderson, has engaged in discriminatory behavior. Specifically, he has unfairly graded and treated a student, Jamal, because of his race." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Jamal could feel eyes on him. He sat up straighter, his hands clenched in his lap. This was the moment that everything had been building toward. "Mr. Anderson," the principal said, turning her gaze to the teacher standing on the stage, "will now publicly apologize to Jamal and to the student body for his actions." Mr. Anderson, visibly uncomfortable, stepped forward. His face was pale as he reluctantly spoke, his voice shaky. "I deeply regret my actions, and I apologize to Jamal, to his family, and to every student here for not upholding the values that I am supposed to represent as a teacher. I will work to ensure this never happens again." The room was silent, save for the quiet sound of Mr. Anderson's voice. It was clear that the apology was forced, but nonetheless, it was an important moment. Jamal, though still hurt by the incident, nodded slightly, accepting the apology for what it was, a necessary step toward change. After the apology, Principal Harris addressed the students once more. "Jamal, Your courage in standing up for yourself and for what is right is commendable. I want to make it clear that we have corrected your grade to an A, and you will receive the recognition you deserve. This is your victory." The applause that followed was loud and genuine. Jamal smiled modestly, his heart swelling with pride and relief. He had been vindicated. Justice had been served. And as the students cheered for him, Jamal realized that this wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever faced injustice. As the assembly came to a close, Jamal felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but he knew now that standing up for what's right could make a difference, not just for him, but for others as well. In the months that followed, Jamal's determination to make a difference grew stronger. With the support of his friends, especially Lila, and guidance from Miss Carter, he began organizing a student-led initiative aimed at promoting fairness and inclusivity within the school's grading system. Jamal worked tirelessly to ensure that every student, regardless of their background, would have the same opportunities to succeed and be treated fairly. The initiative gained momentum quickly as more and more students joined, eager to be a part of a movement that would create a positive change in the school. Jamal and his peers worked with teachers and administrators to draft new policies that focused on unbiased grading and a commitment to equality. Through his hard work, Jamal became a voice for those who had been silenced by discrimination. The climax of this journey came during the school's annual event, where Jamal was invited to speak in front of the entire student body. Standing at the podium, his hands were steady, and his heart was filled with purpose. He addressed the crowd, speaking from the heart. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that you're not worthy," Jamal began, his voice ringing with conviction. "We all deserve fairness and respect, and we have the power to stand up for it. Together, we can break down the walls of injustice that hold us back." The applause that followed was deafening. Jamal had not only overcome adversity, but had turned it into a catalyst for change, inspiring those around him to believe in their own strength and potential. For Jamal, it was just the beginning of a journey that would lead him to make an even greater impact on the world.